This video is going to be about putting flutes in tapered columns, and most of you have probably already done straight flutes in a straight column, and that's not much of a problem. But when you get to a tapered column, it is a problem, because what happens is, as you taper the column, you have to get them narrower up here than they are down here. And as you can see, the flute itself is tapered. So how you do that is by depth. The deeper you go in, the wider it gets. So as you come up to the top, it has to be, the tool has to be out a little bit. So you're only going in a depth on this one. I think it was 14 thousandths at the top, but it was 24 thousandths at the bottom. There was 10 thousandths difference. And this one here, I made a special jig for. This jig is nothing but a slug of metal, and I put a slot down the middle exactly in the center. And you see there's a wider slot. That was for the other column. Now the narrower slot is for this column, and it's exactly centered. And this hole is exactly centered. All I did was counterbore this so I could put an Allen screw in here and tap the bottom of these columns. And if I screw that in there, it's dead center in both directions. And there it is, solid in that. And now I have a pin in my 4-inch rotary table here. And that centers that jig onto the table. This just goes on there like that, and that puts it right dead center. And we'll put the Allen screws in there. Now I've already determined that I want 6 flutes in this, and the way I did it was take a magic marker and put a straight edge here so I could draw a line on it and rotate it and say, well, I can fit 6 of them in there. And this one, I think I ended up with 10. But it's sort of a trial and error thing. You have to figure it out. You can measure around there and figure out do a lot of mathematics on how wide this is going to be and how wide that's going to be. But what you want to shoot for is the center part that isn't milled should be fairly straight. Now we're going to show you how to determine the width of the flutes at each end. And we're going to start off by measuring the diameter of the top, which is 240 thousandths. Then I'm going to measure the other end and write that down, which is 315 thousandths. So what I've determined is it's basically 62 thousandths for the flute and 62 thousandths for the space in between, all the way around here. Now, we're not going to worry about the bottom yet. The first place, what's going to show if you make a mistake is the top. If you get them, you know, too wide or too narrow or something, it'll really show up. It doesn't show up so much at the bottom, but the thing you're shooting for is an absolutely straight line here, visually. And visually is pretty hard to see a 10 thousandths difference, but let's just measure this one and see what it is. That's about 8 thousandths over down there. So there's actually an 8 thousandths difference, but you can't see it. And that's very acceptable. That's a good looking fluting job. I've determined on these flutes that I want a 1/8 inch ball end mill. And what you want is you want the base to be just about the width of the end mill, because the deeper you go in on this, of course, the wider the flute becomes. So if you have the base so that it's the same width as the end mill, you take away one problem, because as you go in deeper, it doesn't change the width. As you come up here, it's going to change the width dramatically, because you're only using the tip of the end mill. So if you go 10 thousandths deeper, it's going to make it a lot wider. So that's what you have to be careful of, that you set that up And I always make an extra one of these, which this is the extra one, to make the mistakes on so I can check out how everything works out. To determine where you start is you always start at the top, because if you make a mistake at the top, it will show up more than it does at the bottom. So I always work from the top down. Now, they take the diameter of the top, which is 240. I'll put this piece of paper over here, you can see. That's the diameter of the top, 240, and that's the diameter of the bottom. And that's times pi equals, that gives me the circumference, which is 753 all the way around. And I'm going to divide that by 6, which gives me roughly 125 thousandths, okay? And then you divide 125 times 2, and that gives you 62 thousandths. So basically, what you have is a 62 thousandths flute and a 62 thousandths space in between. Now we're going to go down to the bottom. We go 315 for the diameter times pi equals 989. You divide that times 6 and you come up with 164. Now what you do is you subtract this number from that, because you want the space between the flutes to be the same and the flute to be wider. So you subtract that number from this number and you end up with 101 thousandths. And if you measure this here, it's pretty hard, but there's the width between the flutes, and there's the flute right there, as close as I can measure. Oh, boy, it's pretty close on. So that seems to work out right. So that would be the way you would do the math. Now we're going to do the setup so you can do this practically on the part. So just as a instructional part of this, I'll show you how you can determine the distance between them and how deep they are without going through a lot of the mathematics. What I've got is, this is a piece of 5/16 steel, and the bottom of this tapered is 5/16. It just happened to work out that I had made this 5/16, and that's, so I don't have to turn this end. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this other end down to this diameter. And if you had to do both of them, you would. But it just happened it was 5/16. So that was 240, which is 10 under a quarter inch. So I'm going to make that 240. And now we have this, the diameter of the top of the column. And the other end is the diameter of the bottom of the column. Instead of using the rotary table, I'm just going to use this collet block because it's 6-sided and I can rotate it just the right amount without putting the chuck onto the rotary table, and save a little time. I'm just eyeballing the center of this because it's just an experiment. We'll see. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down and touch this with it running so I can get a mark in it. That's just marking it. So I'm going to zero this, lock the table. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come down 5 thousandths on it. Now what I can do is I've done it 5 thousandths deep. I can take this out of here because of the way it's set up, and I can measure that. And that's obviously too narrow because I know it's 10 thousandths, but I'll try to measure it. It's about 40 thousandths, I think. But so now I'll put it in and come down 10. Now, the reason I use this collar block is I can put that right back in there, and I can come down, let's go down to 10. And I'll put 6 flukes in it, and then I'll see if it looks satisfactory. Okay, that's the way the top would look at 10 thousandths deep with the same diameter as the top of the flute. But what I'm going to do now is turn this around, and I'm going to go 20 thousandths deep on the other end and see what it looks like. You see the mark that it made there, so I'm just touching it. So now I'm going to come down 20 thousandths, and I'm going to go all the way around 20 thousandths deep. There you have what it'll look like at the bottom. Now what I'm going to do is measure this. This width here should be the same top and bottom, and you've got it right. So that proves that all the math was right and everything was working pretty good. And to hold that on, and this is a centering pin. So that's dead center, hopefully. I got to get some bolts for the T-nuts. Okay, so that's all set up all the way around. And I'm going to show you another thing to do that will take out any mistakes. But first thing, you want to get it solid and as close to centered as you can. Bolt this down. I'm just going to snug this up just a little bit. And then I'm going to tap it in to make sure it's tight. Now, if I run this around, it should be pretty good. Whoop. It's not moving at all. It's exactly right. See that? It's within a couple of thousandths. So that's good. That's a good setup. All we're going to do is put in the 1/8 ball end mill and run a test to see how it worked out with all our math. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the machine on, and I'm just going to barely mark that. And then I'm going to run it across and see how deep it is on the other end. And if everything works out right, I just go 10 thousandths deeper and come back, and I've got it 10 thousandths deep on this end and full depth on that end. So now I want to set up the stop for that end. Now I'm going to come down 10 thousandths, and then I'm going to bring it back across. So there it is, 10 thousandths at this end, and about 25 thousandths deep on the other end. I'm going to rotate this to 60 degrees. Stop. So I got to set this end stop up too, so they all come out the same. Marking it now. So now I'm going to crank it all the way down. You can see the width of the part that isn't cut is basically a straight line, and that's what you're shooting for. We'll crank it around to 120. $240. Okay. Yeah. $300. Now we'll take it out of there and see if it's usable. Looks pretty good to me. We'll clean that off and we'll show you. What I did is I put a jack bolt in here so I can jack it up and down. And I know that if I turn this, that it moves it 10 thousandths per flat. But what you have to do is adjust that so you have a 10 thousandths difference, a 12 thousandths difference actually to the other end. But as you can see, it's going deeper and deeper. And it's just about 12 is what I'm looking for. And that's almost exactly 12 thousandths. So it'll come out 22 thousandths deeper on this end, which is very acceptable. I had figured it at 25, but I later on determined that it didn't have to be 25, 23, 22 would be fine. And so that's what I did. So if I crank it back and forth, as you can see, it's just going in deeper, 10 thousandths. And when I make my cut, I'll start at 0 here and just touching, and I'll cut down here and it'll be 10 thousandths deep here. I mean 12 thousandths deep here. What I'll do is crank down another 10 thousandths and come back this way, and it'll be 10 thousandths here and 22 thousandths there. But what you have to do is determine by the method that I showed you with the little scrap of metal, this, you determine how deep they are, then you determine how much difference you want from there to there. And that'll give you the proper depth for your flutes. As you can see, that's just almost exactly 12 thousandths to that end. So this is the engine that I'm working on, and this is what the fluted columns are for. And because I'm scaling it down 25%, I have to change everything, and none of the dimensions work on the other one. But as you can see, those make nice columns. And this holds up the governor, which goes in behind here, bolts in. And we'll show this from time to time as I get it more finished, but this is just what I have so far. Thank you for watching, and if you've learned something, give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And I went to Cabin Fever, I guess it was last week or a week before, and a young man came to my table that was 9 years old, and he's built 2 engines already, and I was very impressed by him. And I want to do a shout out to him. I'm not going to mention his name right now, but thank you very much for coming to my table, and I hope to see you next year.